Hey, what is up? Welcome to this episode of the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lofrumento. And also, as always, I'm excited to talk about deeply important things here in today's episode with an incredible guest who's going to talk to us about all things high performance, optimizations, capacity building, lots of big topics that literally affect every single one of us entrepreneurs. If you have a business or you want to have a business, this episode is very important for you to tune into. And we are joined by the incredible, the passionate, a fellow podcast host, Dr. Jared Sinclair. Dr. Jared Sinclair is the founder and CEO of Sinclair Performance Institute, where he provides performance improvement, change management, leadership development, and capacity building solutions for individuals and businesses. Dr. Sinclair is an accomplished scholar-practitioner with over 25 years of experience leading, managing, and directing specialized teams across various industries, and with a doctorate in organizational change and leadership and an M.B.A. in financial management, Dr. Sinclair draws on a depth of knowledge in topics of leadership, change management, finance, performance improvement, and enhancing capacity for growth. So much to dive into today. I'm not going to say anything else. Let's dive straight into my interview with Dr. Jared Sinclair. All right, Dr. Jared, holy cow, so much good stuff we're going to dive into today. First things first, welcome to the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
Thanks, Brian. I'm so excited to be here. I'm excited to get going, and let's talk about the things we got to talk about.
Heck yeah, and I know it's going to be plentiful, and the fun part is neither you nor I know exactly where we're going to end up today, but I think where we need to start is you're going to have to fill in those gaps beyond the bio for listeners. Tell them who you are, how the heck did you get here?
Yeah, so my name is Jared Sinclair. I really cut my teeth in the government sector. I'm a former Marine, was in the Marine Corps for 10 years, saw combat in Afghanistan, did some contracting after the Marine Corps, naturally went into the government sector from there. And while I was in the government sector, I just kind of realized that, hey, there's something more to do in life. You know, my capacity was much greater than what I was doing. So I started seeking out doctoral programs in organizational change and leadership because I was invigorated and inspired by, you know, the ability that people have to change organizations for higher performance. So I ended up going to grad school, graduated from grad school. And during that transition, I started cutting my teeth providing pro bono consulting services for nonprofit organizations. So I would go out there, find these nonprofit organizations there's various websites that you can find them on. And I would join these nonprofit organizations and come alongside of them and really to help them while I was building my resume in order to span eventually out into the larger business landscape. So that's where I ended up cutting my teeth. Since then, I've developed Sinclair Performance Institute. We currently serve sub $10 million businesses. A lot of the stuff that we focus on is capacity building. We focus on systems. We focus on internal team motivation, culture, communication. Really, when we come alongside with an organization, a business, we'll go in, we'll try to identify those pain points and those challenges, and then get to the root cause. And what we found is that root cause typically is aligned with 5 or 4 categories, and we can get to that a little bit. More recently, I started a podcast. It's the Performance Collective podcast, where I interview business owners or high performance leaders or people that are accelerating in their craft. They're accelerating where they are, they're blooming where they're planted, and they're making things happen. In addition to that, I do have another consulting line that we're currently looking at, and that's in the dental space. It's called Performance DDS. And what we're doing is we're taking these concepts that I mentioned previously that have been successful in the nonprofit sector, the government sector, and in the private sector, and we're applying those concepts specifically to dental practices.
Yeah, I love the fact that you're applying all of your life experience, really. It's not just business experience, it's life experience, not only to the businesses that you work with, but also now taking it into the dental industry. And it's no secret, you are obviously the spouse of a dentist, so you have close connections there. And it's fascinating how these things translate across all industries. But even beyond that, what I'm going to really put a spotlight on first and foremost, Jared, is thank you for your service, because what I found found is that people who have gone through what you've gone through, serving our country, being in the military, that puts you in a upper echelon when it comes to high performance, when it comes to you going places mentally, physically, preparation wise, that most of us have never, thankfully, had we've never been forced to go there through our normal line of life in this country. So that means so much that when I get to learn from people like you who have served, I just know that to you, high performance means so many different types of things because of those mental, physical, tactical, preparation, all of those challenges that you faced, which leads me to, I guess, the broadest question I'll ask you all day, Jared, is what is high performance to you? Why are you so passionate about this stuff?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer when I look at performance. I think we are here on earth to leave it in a better place. We find ourselves in an organization where we're blessed with a family. We get married, we inherit, maybe some folks, maybe a business, something of that nature. I think it's our job and our responsibility to leave that in a better place than when we found it. And the only way to do that is to perform at our highest level and then identify what that highest level is and push ourselves even further. And the way we do that is through building capacity, right? And when I talk about capacity, what I'm really talking about is motivation. We need to be motivated to do the things that we're looking to do. And where does that motivation come from? How does it play into that capacity? I'm talking about knowledge, right? How does that declarative or that procedural knowledge, the know what and the know how type of knowledge play into motivation? Sometimes there's an asymmetry there. If you don't have enough knowledge and you're doing something, it's a stretch goal. But if that goal is too stretch, it's going to affect your motivation, right? So that's where knowledge can play into motivation. And gaining more knowledge will help you become more motivated. You're going to build upon those skills that you've already experienced. In addition to that, there's systems. So we have to look at the systems in which people are operating. And those systems might be in an organization. They might be in a family. They might be, if you're an entrepreneur, what type of support or team do you have rallying around you? So those systems are also important. And then lastly, looking at communication. Communication 101, right? Communication is always a big issue. So how are you communicating internally with your team? How are you communicating with your clients? And then how are you communicating with yourself? Are you taking time to reflect on your successes and where you're going with yourself? So to wrap all of that up, it's a kind of a bad word, but accountability, and it doesn't have to be cruel, accountability is where it's at, knowing where you are, where you want to be, developing a strategy and a system and a plan and the skill sets around that, which is capacity, to raise yourself up and to achieve a higher performance level.
Yeah, I love the fact, I'm going to call this out for listeners because I think it's a really powerful concept, is that when we talk about high performance, you talked about doing the best of your abilities and then reaching for a little bit more. It reminds me, once upon a time it's probably an event or conference in Costa Rica that I was at, where the speaker said to everyone in the audience, he said, okay, do the biggest exhale until you can't anymore and hold it. And so we all did that. We all inhaled and then we held it. And then he said, okay, inhale a little bit more. And even though we were holding what was allegedly our biggest inhale ever, we could still find some additional air to inhale. And so it wasn't our peak capacity. We thought that it was. And it also reminds me of, it's a concept by Seth Godin, who's one of my favorite marketers in the whole world. I use examples from him all the time, where he talks about the dangers of flying too low. He talks about the Icarus deception, where the danger is that when you fly too low, you think that you're away from the sun, so you're safe. But the reality is it's easier to crash into the ground. So we need to fly even higher. We need to start thinking bigger. And Jared, what I've found in my life as I've matured as a person and as an entrepreneur is that the bigger questions that I asked, the bigger answers that I've found. How much of your work when it comes to high performance factors in, hey, this is beyond your realms of what you've accomplished to date, but there's so much bigger that you don't even know. We're only scratching the iceberg of what we're capable of. How do you navigate those waters for people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest things that I find in that space is that we have these business owners, these founders, these people that are running successful or marginally successful businesses, and they're doing it, right? But they haven't taken the time to pause and really assess, okay, what's going to get us to that next level? What are we lacking in order to get to that next level? Or why have we plateaued? Why are we stalemated, right? So what I do is we come in alongside of them, and we really start to hone in on, okay, what are you doing, right? What are you doing well? What other options do you have? What alternatives do you have? What's going well with your team? What's not going well with your team? Do you have a strategy? Have you outgrown your strategy? Do we need to revamp your strategy? Or sometimes there's specific problems that they might be facing, specific skill deficiencies. So with all that being said, we can come alongside them, and we can kind of Sherpa them to a point where they come to this realization of, oh yeah, we do need to take a closer look at what we're doing. We do need to look at our financials. We do need to look at our marketing plan. We do need to look at how we're retaining or acquiring new employees. So what it comes down to typically is that aha moment of like, man, I was so busy in the day-to-day work. I was so busy focusing on those things that I've focused on for the last 3 to 5 years that I forgot to pause. I forgot to pause and take a look at my organization and see where we can truly improve, where are we lacking, what are the metrics saying? And sometimes they don't even have metrics, right? So that's a consideration too, is diving into the numbers, not only on the financial side, but there's a whole plethora of metrics that we could look at in any organization to really help diagnose those root causes. And when we identify those root causes, we can identify strategies to improve those root causes and that performance.
Yeah, I love that you talk about root causes, which I totally want to go there, because listeners are probably thinking, Jared, clear up what I'm struggling with right now. Where do I even go? But before we get there, I want to point out a really important takeaway from what you just shared with us, which is if nothing changes, then nothing changes. All of us are busy running our businesses, hopefully growing our businesses. All of us are doing that. But if we keep doing this, we will keep getting the results that we're currently getting. If you're happy with those, awesome. But if you want to reach a new level, something has to change. It's something that I remind myself of constantly. Is every single week I ask myself, forward looking, what has to change? Whether it's in life, whether it's in fitness, relationships, whatever it may be, what has to change? Because changes are where changes come from. You have to change your behavior to change your outcomes, which sounds so obvious, but the less obvious part of it, Jared, which I'd love for you to expand upon now, is what if we don't know what to change? Especially, I'm thinking about all those newer entrepreneurs listening to us right now who are thinking, well, yeah, I don't like where my business is at financially. I don't have a team. I'm a solopreneur. I don't even know if my products or services are good. I have no idea what I'm doing with marketing. Where the heck do I start with changing all these things?
Yeah, so it comes from an awareness, right? And when you're so closely embedded in the market or in the business that you're trying to impact, sometimes you get blinders put up, right? So I'm not pitching the idea of hiring a consultant or a coach, but it is helpful because they bring in that outside perspective that might not already be there. It's also challenging, though, because they don't know the complexities within your organization. So what you might do is you might sit down with your team. There's several tactics that you can do with this. Coaches, the internet, YouTube, everybody's going to show you different stuff that you can use. But typically what I will do is I'll sit down with the client, I'll get to their pain point. I typically use the 5 whys. I typically will use like a herringbone, right? Or a process where we continue to dive in deeper. If it's a group facilitation, we'll have a group of the shot callers, right? Or the people that have an impact on the direction of the organization. And we will, I call it Jerry Springering it. We'll just get around a table, we'll identify a problem, and we'll just idea that problem all the way down and distill it all the way down till we get to an actual root cause. Here's an example. So one of the challenges that somebody, let's say in an office building might have is if the front office has a responsibility to shred paper, right? And I'm going to break this down very simply. And they're not shredding paper, right? The manager might come over to them and be like, hey, folks, why aren't we shredding this paper? Why has the paper been full of unshredded paper? And what you might find is they just don't do it. And they say, well, we had more important things to do. All right. Well, why do you have more important things to do? Well, because we have to get, project X completed. Right. Well, yeah, but I told you to shred paper. So, somewhere along the line, you got to do that with project X. The challenge is when you get down to it, the answer that they might give you is that they don't know how to work the shredder. Right. So with this accountability kind of system, this root cause model, is it the receptionist's fault that the paper's not getting shredded, or is it the manager's fault that the manager didn't provide training, that knowledge piece to shred the paper, right? So that's a simple explanation. But we can apply that same concept of, do they have the requisite knowledge to do the job? If they don't have the requisite knowledge, can we provide them with the requisite knowledge? Can we do it in-house, or do we have to outsource it? And then I would say that accountability model, right? You have to have a starting point and you have to have an end goal. So how do you know you're progressing across that goal if you're not tracking data of some sort, right? So that's how we would get to the root cause. We'd get to it. We'd find out, is it a knowledge deficiency? Is it a motivation deficiency? Or is it an accountability deficiency? Or is it a systems deficiency? And if it's one of those or a combination, which it typically is a combination, we will design systems with that client around that deficiency in order to expand that capacity, improve the motivation, increase the knowledge, and thus improve performance.
Dang, so much in that answer that I want to go to. I love the example of the paper shredder. I'm going to call this out for listeners. So obviously we're speaking from our own experiences here. For me, as someone who's worked in marketing for a long time now, I see it all the time when people say to me, Facebook ads don't work. I always say, let's open up your Facebook ads campaign. Let's look at it. And if their targeting is completely wrong, if you're selling dog food, but you're only targeting cat owners, well, of course the campaign's not going to work. It's not because Facebook ads doesn't work. It's because you didn't work. Or maybe your offer sucks. I hate to say it to a lot of people, but it's often not the thing that you think it is. And I love how you just listed those off to us about the different root causes: knowledge problem, motivation problem, accountability problem. Jared, I know listeners, especially since a lot of them are probably on the go, you and I both know this as podcast hosts, break down all of those for us and list them out again for us, because I think that that's such an interesting lens. You said it about having a coach or consultant. We can't read the label from inside the jar. Break that down for us, because we probably have never assessed our own businesses on those root cause layers that you just shared with us.
Yeah, so what I focus on is, I call it Mask C. I'm actually in the process of writing a book to build out this framework so the listeners or my clients can have a framework to go off of. So Mask C, it's MASK-C. And what I touch on is motivation and the underpinning or the underlying dynamics of motivation. What gets people moving in a certain direction? I touch on accountability, right? How can we use accountability to drive motivation, to make sure that our systems are working the way that they're designed? I touch on systems, which is closely tied to accountability and motivation. I'm going to touch on knowledge, 3 types specifically. I'm going to look at declarative knowledge, right? The knowing what. Procedural knowledge, which is like the knowing how. And then metacognitive knowledge, which is the reflection that one would have, thinking about thinking. How did we do, right? And then lastly, communication. Communication is a big piece. You can have a greatest plan in the world. You can have the greatest process, the greatest procedure. But if you're not communicating that, and not just through word, we communicate by what we write, what we say, the things that we have in our organization. WD-40 is famous for having a TP, right there in their lobby, and I actually went down and saw it. So that's an organizational communication piece, and then taking all those things together. And when we take all those things together, we're able to build capacity. Typically, a deficiency in an individual, a team, or an organization is applied to one of those 5 things: motivation, accountability, systems, communication, or knowledge.
Yeah, I love the fact that you've got an acronym for that as well. And I love that you're turning it into a book, because gosh, do we all need that. So listeners, now you can remember it. It's Mask C, which is motivation, accountability, systems, knowledge, and communication. And Jared, the thing that I really like about all this is that it applies. This is why I'm a sucker for frameworks. To me, frameworks mean that you've actually taken your time to study and be intentional about business strategies and systems, because you show this works throughout all different types of businesses. Now you're also applying it to the dental industry, for example. It's easy for us as, let's say, online entrepreneurs to think, well, I sell online courses. My business is nothing alike when it comes to dental practices. But the reality is business and humans are humans. Talk to us about those parallels that you've seen, having worked across so many industries. Where do you see these patterns that say, hey, you know what? At the end of the day, we're all the same?
Yeah. As long as we are hiring humans to do work, we're going to have human problems. And I don't know who said that quote or if I'm paraphrasing that quote, but that's the reality of it. We have humans working in organizations, and therefore we're going to have human problems. We're going to continue to have these human problems, which means we need to bring human assessment and human solutions, right? I think it was on one of your previous podcasts where you had a gentleman that was doing marketing, and he talked about the same thing, how you can use specific tactics in marketing and overlay them maybe on the way that you're marketing or to reach your clients. So it's the same concept there. If you take a small business, let's say they're a small architecture firm, and you're working with a small architecture firm. You're looking at how they do business, how they attract clients, how they carry out their processes, how they deliver their deliverables. There's going to be parallels between that and what a dental practice is doing. People come in the door, they want a product, they get the product, they set an appointment, they leave. They come back, they pay you, whatever the case may be. There's going to be a system there. So when you look at individual systems, you can borrow from other organizations, from other industries, and you can overlay what works for them on what you're doing in your own industry. So that's why I love working in the consulting space and working with so many various types of clients, because I really get to leverage. It's almost not fair. I really get to leverage the knowledge that I get from other industries or other types of business, apply it to my framework, and then see if there's consistencies that I can bring to bear on another client's problems. So I think it's beneficial to that end client, but it also feels a little bit, like I have all the information, which I don't. I'm compiling the information that I get from other people, the problems that are at hand, with my knowledge base and the research that I've read, and I'm developing systems and solutions for those clients that I'm working with that are sitting right in front of me.
I feel like you just revealed one of our biggest secrets here in public, Jared, because I've always kind of felt the same way. When I work, I've got businesses in different industries. I've got clients in different industries. And when I work, let's say within the academic world, and I'll say, oh, we could be using this tool. They say, how did you ever think of it? And the reality is because I've seen it. And in the sports world, it's the most obvious solution that everybody in the sports world is leveraging. But if you don't go outside of your own bubbles, you'll never be able to pick things up from other industries. So Jared, you're right. You are very uniquely positioned to help businesses because you see inside of so many different types. Along those lines, one thing, it strikes me right when I'm on your website, I want to call out Sinclair Performance Institute. Your website is sinclairperformance.com, which we'll talk about at the end of this episode. But one thing that I particularly love about your messaging is you have a section that says, we step in to help when our clients, and then you have a list of bullet points. You are literally telling people, hey, here's the trigger. If you are feeling overwhelmed and or burnt out, boom, perfect time to talk to us. If you need to enhance leadership skills, boom, perfect time to talk to us. To me, it's in the world of marketing and sales, I always call it triggers. You have these triggers where if people are experiencing this, what are the triggers for your type of work, even outside of your business? Let's think about all the business owners who are listening and they're thinking, well, yeah, I do try to be a high achiever, a high performer every day. What are the triggers that we need to build into either our workflows, our systems, our weeks, our months, our years? What are the triggers for us to sit down and assess? Because obviously assessment is such a core part of your approach. What are those triggers that force us to do this work?
Yeah, sorry, I got the gardeners here blowing in the background there. So what we typically see is a lack of strategic focus. Typically, like I said, these organizations are working, they're making money, they're breaking even, but they don't have that strategic focus to push them 5 years forward or look at the next 3 years. The other thing is team, right? Especially following COVID-19, a lot of organizations are having a challenge retaining their people. And I think that's why the motivation piece and that communication piece is so important, because you have to keep your people engaged. And if you're not communicating with them or they're not able to communicate with you, how are you going to be able to keep them engaged? How are you going to be able to retain them? And we all know that attracting new employees or new specialists or whatever we're looking at can be very challenging. It can be very expensive, very time consuming. And then when you bring that other person in, that other person might change the dynamic of your culture within your organization. So now you're working through a change management perspective, right? Not change management from the perspective of I'm adding this new technology or this new CRM, but change management from the perspective of now I'm bringing in a new employee, which brings in a different dynamic to my organization or to my office. So the other way that it manifests itself is in the strategy. Do we know why we're doing what we're doing? Specifically for nonprofits. The nonprofits that I work for, a lot of times it comes in the form of fundraising, right? And we can draw parallels between sales and regular business, but nonprofits are very distinct in the sense that they rely heavily on grants and endowments and just goodwill from the people that are giving them money. So being able to talk with them and trying to get them to think outside the box. What are other ways that they might be able to raise money or be a better fiduciary of the money that they do have? The other thing that I see specifically in a dental space, and this is why I thought it was important to dive into the dental space with my Mask C framework, is because dentists go to school for 3 to 4 years. I think there's only a couple 3-year schools out there. And within those 3 to 4 years, they're only getting a week, 2 or 3, or maybe they're getting kind of sprinkled throughout their dental school, how to run a business. So there's a big industry out there of people that will say that they're a coach and they're going to come in and they're going to help you build your practice. But the challenge is, how do you sort through that? How do you know who really knows what they're talking about and who doesn't, right? And then the challenge with dentists specifically is they haven't received, unless they have a past life, they haven't received much training on how to run a business. They're interested in doing dentistry. And they want this business to work because they've worked so hard for it. They've paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for their practice, in addition to hundreds of thousands of dollars for their education. So it's important for them to be able to make that business viable. So bringing that leadership capability and allowing this dentist who might be 24, 25, 26, 30 something, but has never really led or managed a team or really led or managed a business, because they weren't trained to. So coming alongside of them and really helping them navigate those waters, navigate, that team of 3 or 12 or however big their office is, has been really, really satisfying. And it's a definite need that's out there specifically to that dental space.
Yeah, I love that you called out the dental space and use that as an example. Obviously, it's an industry that you serve deeply with one of your companies, but I think it also brings up a few other important points. So, for example, my sister just finished veterinarian school, and same exact case. Some of her classmates, when I was at her, I don't know what it was, some ceremony about placement and matching and all that, but some of her classmates were asking me, "Wait, you run your own business? We want to start our own vet practice," but they didn't tell us anything about how to do that. And I think it's true for all of us, let's face it, is that you don't know how to ride a bike until you actually get your butt in the saddle and ride a bike. We see it on the political sphere. However anyone feels politically, I always laugh when I hear people say, "Oh, so-and-so isn't qualified to be president. They've never done something like that before." And then you look at what every president who leaves office says, and they always say, nobody knows the scope of this job until you do it. So it's especially true for all of us entrepreneurs. So for all of you listening thinking, "Well, yeah, Jared, I haven't done that either." You're right. And we get that. And that's why it is about providing awesome content like Jared and I both do on our podcast, through our services like Jared does with his consulting companies. But I want to talk about something that not only the knowledge that I know people probably don't have, but systems. It's a word that you brought up quite a few times in our episode here today, is systems. And I know a lot of entrepreneurs are sitting there thinking, "Dr. Jared, what do you mean systems? I don't have systems. How can I make those systems better?" What are some of those systems that strategically are the linchpins? You already mentioned a CRM, and I love that leaked into some of your answers already. What are some of those essential systems, whatever your business is, that we all need to have?
Yeah, I think it's people management. Whether it's your team, you look at systems from the perspective of, how do you manage your team? How do you manage performance evaluations? How do you manage feedback? How do you manage coaching and mentorship? How do you treat those tenured employees different from those employees that are just onboarding? What type of training programs do you have? Speaking of onboarding, when you're onboarding somebody, how do you know that they're ready to be set free? Oftentimes it's this very subjective kind of feeling like, "Oh yeah, I think, somebody, an executive or the director might ask the manager, 'Hey, is this person ready?' And the manager might be like, 'Yeah, they've done quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3. I think they're ready.'" Right? But there's no actual concrete measurement there. So what happens when that person lands and they're required to be held accountable? Right? There's that word again, held accountable to produce a certain product, but they haven't been trained knowledge, right, to do that job. So when they have that deficiency because they're being held accountable for something that they don't have the skill sets necessarily to do, now that's going to translate into motivational issues. So that's why that system's important. Another way you might look at systems is, how do we deal with people? How do we deal with our clients? How do we deal with client engagement? I'll talk specifically from the practice management perspective. When a patient comes in the door and they're fearful typically, right? They're going to come in the door, they're going to get this dental treatment, they don't know what's going to happen, they're going to be put back in a very vulnerable position in the chair, and they're going to have this somewhat stranger working on their mouth for 30 minutes to 60 minutes. So it's a very vulnerable situation. So how do we structure that practice in a way and that patient experience in a way where they feel comfortable doing that, right? And when we look at the fear component, I mean, we're getting to the core of our brain, that fight or flight, right? Where people are having these very deeply bedded emotional responses to some of these things. So how do we set up our systems in the dental practice to specifically overcome that? What scripts are we using? How are we talking about money? How are we talking about treatment planning? When are we scheduling their next appointment? At what point during that interview or during that patient experience are we scheduling that next appointment? At what point are we upselling them if there's an upsell opportunity, right? So these are all the types of things that come into play when I think of systems. We might also look at maintenance records, right? If you're running, let's say, a tree trimming business, and you've got 50 chainsaws and you got these giant chippers, and you have all the safety equipment for the guys climbing the trees, and you have to follow these safety rules. Well, is there a system in place to make sure that OSHA's not going to crawl up your business, next month because you failed to look at something? So is there a system in place? And a lot of times that might look like a checklist, right? It might look like training, but during that training, you're actually doing the checklist. So that's the way that I see systems playing into these small businesses. Again, and this is at the 10 million minus, right? When you get into these larger organizations, these big corporations, you're going to have whole teams that are going to hopefully deal with these things. You might have a compliance team, you might have a training team, and all of those teams are kind of overlapping to fulfill that systems issue. But that presents another point if those 3 teams or 4 teams, however many teams are responsible for that, are not communicating. So there's challenges there as well.
Yeah, listeners, this stuff is so important that Dr. Jared is sharing with us right now. I love the fact that you're using the dentist office as an example, because something we can all relate to is that we know what our experience is when we go to the dentist, sitting in the chair. The worst part is waiting for the Novocaine to kick in. That is my least favorite part of being at the dentist. And then the checkout process. Hey, when can we get you in for your next appointment? All of these things are intentionally thought out. If they're thought out well, if they have the guidance of someone who's doing it. I'll put myself on blast. I'll never forget. It's 2012. I was living in Boston. I had just started my marketing agency. My business partner and I were like, let's go out and get our first client today. So we had spent months thinking about what our service was going to be. And in this case, it's for a local restaurant. It was a sandwich shop. We were going to do SMS marketing for them. So this was our service. We knew so much about it, Jared. We knew everything that was included, what the frequency of our marketing would be, all of that. So we walked into the sandwich shop. We said we'd like to speak to the owner. And this huge Italian guy looked down at us. We were kids in our early 20s. And he goes, all right, I'm the owner. What do you want? And we pitched to him and he said yes, that's the optimal outcome that we were looking for. But his next question was, what do we do next?
Right.
I didn't have an answer. I had no idea what to say to him. And the reality is I didn't think about onboarding systems. I didn't think about anything other than, hey, this is the problem that's smack dab in front of my face right now is I need to get a sale. And that's all that I knew how to fix. So for you listeners, it's so important to think about these things and having a framework to go through and thinking about all the different types of systems in our businesses. This will put you forward faster. I wish I was having this conversation with you, Jared, more than a decade ago, because you would have saved me some embarrassment, quite frankly, as well as you would have accelerated my business growth. I want to talk, as we're coming towards the end of this interview, there's so much more that we could dive into, which is why I'm glad you also have a podcast. But I want to talk about that accountability piece, because you've mentioned it a few times, specifically let's talk this section about solopreneurs. Solopreneurship is something you and I can both relate to at various points in our careers. A lot of listeners are solopreneurs, and they're probably thinking to themselves, who's going to hold me accountable? How do I hold myself accountable? What's that look like for you?
The universe will, and that's the short answer, right? So if you're a startup, if you're in a startup or you're a founder, you find out very quickly that it's very difficult to get things going, and the universe will take the markets will take care of that for you, unless you have some groundbreaking product, right? So the way that I see accountability is the literature will tell you that there's accountability. There's two components to it. There's typically a provider, right? The person that's required to or responsible to do that task. And then there's a director, there's a person directing it. So if you're a solopreneur, or a Wantrepreneur, as your podcast title says, trying to get to that point where you're actually doing it, you're both, right? So the way that you can do that is you can identify key metrics that you're working for. Are you trying to identify specific people or specific sales targets? Are you trying to identify specific market penetration? Are you trying to identify, I'm going to post a certain amount of content per week? Those numbers, those metrics will be your accountability partner, if you will. So they will be that director. They will be that person or that thing telling you what to do. Now, if you have a team, if you have a small team, let's say you have a co-founder, or you have a small board of directors as you're getting this thing going, it's incumbent upon that team to develop that strategic plan, to apply metrics and to apply timelines to it, and to apply specificity to those things that you're trying to do. Oftentimes I see founders or startups that are trying to get going, and what they don't do is they don't detail those dashboards to a specific enough level to determine if they've moved the needle or not. So with that comes math, metrics, right? A lot of people don't like that. But in the startup phase, I think that accountability piece to yourself and to your small team is very important. What you'll find with like tech startups too is another area is tech startups will typically, a tech startup will have like a co-founder or two, and they have a bunch of VC guys, right? And then you have this space and time where they're really trying to scale and penetrate the market to a point where they can remain viable, and they maybe don't have to raise as much funds or do another round of fundraising. But during that time, they're using generalists, right? Or they should be using generalists. Clearly, you have to have people that are smart enough to design the technology. But you also need people that can pivot from marketing one day to finance the next day to, pitching to a VC the next day to, making sure that your process is aligned with lean principles, whatever the case may be. And as that business scales through time, you can get to a point where you can become more specific and more specialized with the people that you hire. So accountability will change through the life cycle. It really depends on where the organization is. But for those startups or those entrepreneurs, those founders, holding you and your small team accountable and getting those numbers on paper and tie them to specific strategic actions with a timeline is very important. It's that whole concept of SMART goals.
Yeah, I love it. When I posed that question to you, quite frankly, I had no idea which direction you take it because there's a million different types of accountability. I know there's some crazy app out there where you choose a cause that you could not possibly be more against. And if you don't meet your goal, it financially contributes out of your money to that cause. So I know there's a lot of different ways, but I think your answer is probably the one that's most effective that I've experienced myself. And I know a lot of other entrepreneurs. It is the metrics. The metrics will hold you accountable. And one word that I want to call out that you said that changed the game for me, especially when I started my agency more than a decade ago, was a dashboard. If you are confronted with the realities, the metrics of your business every single day, and you choose what you're going to focus on growing, you will start doing it. So I think that that's a really wise answer there as far as accountability is. Let the metrics guide you. Jared, as we come towards the end of this interview, I always love giving my guests the hardest part of it because we talked about so many different aspects today. We talked about root causes. We talked about all 5 elements of your Mask C framework. We talked about systems. We talked about so many different things, but listeners are going to be all sorts of excited to take action. What is something that you think every listener should do after hearing today's episode? What's something that they should sit down and say, gosh, I loved that Dr. Jared made this point. This is what I need to focus on for the next week or month.
Yeah. So what I would say is you're capable. You are capable to take that next logical step towards that big, nasty, there's a lot of books out there, that goal, right? You are capable to do that. You just have to do it. And in doing so, you'll find that you are capable of way much more than you ever knew. Because what happens when you push yourself is you gain agency, you gain the capability, you gain those skill sets. And with those gained skill sets, you continue to progress, right? So it's all about momentum. It's all about just taking that next logical step and moving forward with that big, crazy goal that you don't think will work or everybody's saying it won't work. Go do it. Because even if you don't end up there, there's this acceptable range of deviation from that goal, and you're still going to end up further down the line than you would have if you didn't take that step. So just take action. Take that next logical step.
Yes, I love that advice. It fits in one of my favorite quotes of all time from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., where he said, "You don't need to see the whole staircase, just take the first step." And your advice there about pushing ourselves. We don't even know. We might think the staircase is going to end at level 2, but you're right. We may have 10 stories of stairs inside of us if we just keep taking that step. So I love that advice. It fits in so well. I feel like we really encapsulated what Sinclair Performance Institute is all about, which is going beyond not only our version of high performance, but pushing ourselves to a version of ourselves that we don't even realize is there. So I think it's a really good segue. Dr. Jared, as we come towards the end here, brag on us for a little bit. Tell us about your business. Drop those links on us. For sure, drop the name of your podcast. Tell us where listeners should go to learn more about you and everything you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So for Sinclair Performance Institute, you could visit us at sinclairperformance.com. For Performance DDS, which is performance specific to the dental industry, it's going to be performancedds.com. We have a YouTube channel where we put up all of our video podcasts, and that's at Performance Collective on YouTube. And then our podcast is called The Performance Collective. So check it out. We talk with exclusively high leaders and business owners, and we try to extrapolate those things similar to what we talked about today that help them become successful. So check it out. We'd love to see you there.
Yes, listeners, I know that you all love podcasts, so definitely check out Jared's podcast. And as you already know the drill, the links that Jared just talked about, as well as to his podcast, love that you're also putting them on YouTube. That is a growing wave. More of us podcasters need to start doing that. So kudos to you for putting in that work to do it. It's so much more of a production, but it's so worth it for the listeners. So I love the work that you're doing. Listeners, check out sinclairperformance.com is where you can find Sinclair Performance Institutes. That's sinclairperformance.com. Or just scroll down wherever it is that you're tuning in. It's in the show notes, as well as a lot more information about Dr. Jared. You heard all of his brilliance here today. So Jared, thank you so much for joining us on the Wantrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast.
You got it, Brian. Thanks for having me.